This is my 16th video on my attempts to construct a small OO gauge layout. See part 1 for my reasons for doing this and my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for more interesting stuff with trains actually running, etc. Although there will actually be a little bit of train running video in this part. This part deals with some very old Hornby Dublo wagons that I obtained, and my attempts to get them running on my layout, with an aside on my attempts to improve the lighting for my OO gauge layout. There will be a bit of actual running video as I get the wagons on the rails. So here are the wagons as they arrived in the post, 5 Hornby Dublo tank wagons, which I got on eBay UK for £13, although it then cost me £25 to get them shipped to me in Canada. That, I'm afraid, is the discouraging side of trying to model British operations in Canada. Clearly these wagons were almost as old as me, dating back at least to the 1950s and perhaps earlier. They weren't in perfect shape, and there were a few repairs that were obviously immediately called for. The tank support frame on the end of this wagon was broken and a piece was missing. The horizontal bar on the top of that frame should extend beyond the vertical bar towards the camera, and the wire, which can be seen projecting loose and dangling, should be connected to the end of that frame. This wagon was simply missing the wire representing the tensioning members on one side of it. And several of the wagons, particularly this one, had rather mangled couplings. The couplings on all of these wagons were of the old Pico Simplex type, as would be expected for old Hornby Dublo stock. The couplings, axles and wheels were also quite rusty in many cases, but otherwise these 60 or 70-year-old wagons were solid and in good shape. I did my best to repair the frame on this wagon. I cut a piece of scrap styrene from a kit to shape and superglued it in place on the end of the wagon, and then once that glue set, superglued the wire to the end of that new frame piece. The repaired frame isn't entirely straight, but I did that more or less deliberately, as I thought that would be the only way I could get the repair to hold against the tension of the wire. For the Eso Wagon at the front right here, I made a new wire to represent the tensioning members by cutting and bending a piece of piano wire of suitable thickness. The original wires were held in place without any glue, just by hooking round on the ends, but I couldn't bend my piano wire well enough to get it to do that, so I ended up just supergluing the ends in place. The result doesn't look too bad as the glue dries transparent. Here are the 5 wagons after initial repairs and clean-up. At this point I put the wagons on the rails on the layout and promptly realized that I had another problem, as when I turned up the power the controller immediately overloaded. Hornby Dublo 3-rail wagons had wheels and axles that were completely non-insulated, connecting the left rail directly to the right. Clearly, some of these wagons were made for Dublo 3-rail and were simply shorting out the power on my layout. On checking, it proved that all of the wagons were indeed made for 3-rail except for the shell wagon that had the broken frame at right here. So I had to temporarily give up on getting the wagons to run on the layout except for that one shell wagon. Here's a little video of that running behind a Hornby Stania 8F among some mainline wagons that I recently obtained, and with on the back an LMS brake van I just built from the Parkside Dundas kit, now distributed by Pico. The only way to get the 3-rail wagons running on my layout was to somehow replace the wheels and axles with something providing insulation, so that the rails would not be shorted out. I reached out to Nigel with British Model Trains in Cambridge, Ontario, just up the road from where I live, and he said that he could definitely help me. He carries quite a wide range of wheels for kit building, etc. However, in this case he had on hand the ideal solution, actual Hornby Dublo wagon wheels, but insulated ones from the 2-rail era. So I was able to buy from him 8 axles of insulated Hornby Dublo wheels. And I was all set to convert my wagons from 3-rail to 2-rail. The pack that you see at bottom left here was from some wheels that I had earlier bought from British Model Trains for some kits I had. I did put those wheels onto the power petrol wagon at top right, but these were 14mm diameter wheels and they were too large, touching the floor of the chassis and not turning freely. That was something I tried before contacting Nigel about getting new wheels for these wagons. Another thing that I bought from Nigel whilst I was visiting him in Cambridge was a pair of converter wagons, i.e. wagons designed to have a simplex coupling on one end and a tension lock coupling on the other end, so facilitating the mixing of rolling stock with these different types of couplings. This was one of the wagons I got from Nigel. This one was a Trix TTR wagon, and it actually came to me with a simplex coupling on one end and no coupling at all on the other end. There were posts with holes in them suitably spaced for mounting a coupling on the end, and I was able to attach a spare Bachmann coupling once I managed to dig out a couple of appropriate small screws. So now this wagon is properly set up as a converter wagon to couple between simplex and tension lock stock. Since the wheels of this wagon were very dirty and rusty, I cleaned them up using a brass wire brush on a rotary tool. In fact, I also did this to all of the Dublo wagons, since many of those were also dirty and rusty. The other wagon I got from Nigel was an old Triang converter wagon, and that didn't need any attention other than a little cleaning up. You can clearly see here the tension lock coupling and the simplex coupling. In this case, the simplex coupling is the later plastic type, but it's still compatible with the older metal simplex couplings. And here are the 2 converter wagons here with their simplex ends coupled together, and so with tension lock couplings at either end. So now I was ready to get to changing the wheels on the 3-rail wagons. When I first tried to do this, I had some trouble figuring out how to get the wheels and axles off. I tried searching forums and didn't find any useful advice, unusually. So it came down to trial and error, and it took me at least half an hour of fiddling about before I figured it out. These old Hornby Dublo 3-rail wagons are entirely metal, not a speck of plastic in their construction. There's a heavy metal cast chassis frame, with the main part of the axle boxes and suspension being all part of this main chassis casting. On top, of course, there's a metal body with wires, etc. Each pair of wheels and the associated axle are simply a single metal part, which is completely rigid. The ends of this axle run in holes in metal bearing parts in the axle boxes, and that is the key to removing the wheels. You can't simply bend the axle boxes and pop the ends of the axle out, as you would do with a modern plastic chassis, since the metal chassis on these wagons is totally rigid and will not bend at all. You just break it if you tried to force it. To remove the wheels and axles, you must remove the small metal bearing piece that is fitted inside the axle box. These bearing parts are made from some kind of fairly thin sheet metal that's quite springy and bendable. The key to removing them is the little tab seen at top right here. That tab, bent over and flat on top of the chassis, is what holds the bearing piece in place. If you pry up that tab, you can pass it back through the slot in the chassis and remove the bearing piece. Here's the view from the bottom. The piece of sheet metal that can be seen here bent round the bottom of the axle box is the other end of the bearing piece whose tab we saw on top of the chassis. Once that tab is straightened, the bearing piece and the end of the axle can be pulled down out of the chassis. On this power petrol wagon, the simplex couplings were also quite seized up and wouldn't pivot from side to side. and they won't work properly if this is the case, so I needed to free the couplings up and oil them until they pivoted from side to side freely. Here's the Shell lubricating oil wagon with its replacement axles fitted. Here you can see the bearing piece and the end of the axle being pulled down out of the axle box after the tab has been pried up. And now here is that wagon with the process completed and the new axles fitted. I found that it was only necessary to take out the bearing piece on one side of each axle. When refitting the bearing pieces, it's important to ensure that the bottom end hooks over the axle box properly. Then the tab can be bent down again on top of the chassis, holding the bearing in place. Here the bearing has been reinserted and the bottom is correctly hooked over the axle box, but the tab hasn't been bent down yet and can be seen protruding above the chassis. And here the tab is bent down, securing the bearing and axle in place. When trying to bend up these tabs to remove the axles, they're sometimes bent down flat so well that it's impossible to get anything underneath them to pry them up. If this is the case, a screwdriver or something similar can be used to lever down on the axle gently and apply pressure. This pressure will cause the tab to start to bend a bit, and then when the pressure is released, it should be possible to get something under the tab to pry it up. I think some of these wagons had seen a lot of use over the years. The ends of the axles tended to have grooves worn in them from turning in the sheet metal bearing pieces, as you can see here. Here's the last of the 4 3-rail wagons with its new wheels fitted. I've put all of the original 3-rail axles and wheels into one of the converter wagons. So now back to the layout. All 5 Dublo wagons, the 4 3-rail and that 1 2-rail, are coupled up between the 2 converter wagons. Here's the Triang converter wagon at the head of the rake, and here's the Trix TTR converter wagon at the back of the rake. I did have to do a bit more bending of some of the metal Simplex couplings in order to get them all to couple up properly. So now let's see my first attempt to run that rake in a train with the Hornby 8F and the mainline wagons and Parkside kit-built brake van as before. Well, that wasn't too successful. Oddly enough, it wasn't the Dublo wagons that were derailing, but the mainline wagons running ahead of them. I'm not sure why that was. Maybe the weight of the train behind was pulling too hard on the front mainline wagons, or maybe there is actually just something wrong with those mainline wagons, which are a recent acquisition themselves. For the moment, I just removed the front mainline wagons and coupled the front converter wagon directly to the tender of the 8F. This met with more success. No problems with derailing there, although there does seem to be a bit of jiggling going over the points, perhaps because of the large flanges on the Dublo wheels. As you may have noticed, the lighting around my 00 gauge layout wasn't very good, so I ordered a 3-lamp LED light fitting from Amazon in an attempt to rectify this issue. Unfortunately, the unit arrived badly broken. The external packaging was solid enough and wasn't damaged. A box arrived, and when I opened that, inside was another box, and when I opened that, inside was another box, and when I opened the third box, inside was a styrofoam block with cardboard taped to its top and bottom. All of these packing materials were quite intact. However, once the cardboard was removed, inside the styrofoam block were the 4 metal sections of the unit pole, as seen here, the 4 black tubes, and the only packing protecting these was in the form of thin plastic tubes like open-ended plastic bags, so no real protection at all. Clearly, the metal sections of the rod had just been bouncing around inside the foam block as the unit was shipped, bashing against each other, and this had resulted in 2 of the 3 lamps being broken from the pole. The design called for the lamps to be attached to the top section of the pole via plastic pieces. These plastic attaching brackets were quite thin, of complex shape, and made of a type of plastic that appeared to be extremely brittle, with the result that impacts during shipping, presumably from other sections of the pole, had completely shattered 2 of these pieces. Here you can see the base of one of the lamps where it was supposed to attach to the pole, and the shattered remains of the attaching piece. I saw all of these sharp pieces of broken plastic inside the inner foam block as soon as I opened it. In fact, I actually cut my finger on one of them trying to pick it up. I tried to contact Amazon customer support about this, but the only solution offered was to return the unit. Given that the unit was large, complex, and heavy due to the weighted base which had been packed separately below the foam cube, and that I'd broken down the cardboard boxes for recycling one by one as I was unpacking it, the prospect of trying to return the item didn't really appear viable. So I ended up lashing the lamps to the pole using a lot of duct tape. This clearly wouldn't have been at all an acceptable solution in a decorator context, but since I was intending to just use this unit in the basement to illuminate my 00 gauge layout, I could live with it. Well, more than I could live with mucking around trying to return the unit to Amazon. The lamps on the unit did work, and it does a reasonable job of improving the lighting around the layout. I've had this type of unit before, and I found that the switches on the lamps weren't very robust and tended to stop working after a time. So I'm intending to just leave those switches on all the time and not mess with them, and turn the unit on and off at the plug each time, which is the same thing I do with a similar unit I have for my N-gauge layout. I only bought this unit from Amazon because due to COVID restrictions I couldn't just go into a store and buy one, which obviously would have offered a better assurance of getting an unbroken unit. Anyway, to finish up this part, here's some video of the train with the Dublo wagons running under the new lighting.